Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we're back from another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Mark Wayne Mullins' less flashy DHS is using the same thuggish tactics from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the government using thuggish tactics, but ultimately the government is in a position of state authority to justify using whatever tactics it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. I don't really care. I think the libertarian position is we gotta get rid of the Department of Homeland Security. Same with all the other, pretty much every other department added, at least since the Civil War. Probably a few of the ones maybe added before the Civil War as well. But ultimately the government's shown to only grow, regardless of which branch of the uniparty's in power. And I think that's important to remember as well. They'll probably add another bullshit government department soon, and there's nothing you can really do about it. Next we have, what are the main differences, disputes, and disagreements between left libertarianism and right libertarianism ideology comparison, posted by Alex Freeman Art, and they said, I'm asking this in order to develop a better mental map of the key points, elements, and concepts that distinguish left libertarians from right libertarians and vice versa. How could these differences and disagreements ideally be outlined, structured, and summarized? What are some clear cases and examples of ideas and policies that are supported by right libertarians and proposed by left libertarians and vice versa? Why is that the case? And yeah, personally, I think, everyone always likes to go about how right and left libertarians disagree, and on some things they do, like, left libertarians don't really believe in private property, for instance, but I think, we gotta stop caring all about these labels so much and support just liberty for all, as long as, no one is getting hurt without their consent. And I think that's very much libertarian position. If you want to be a right libertarian or left libertarian and want to justify enforcing your values on others, I think justify whatever you want to. But I personally think the libertarian position is live and let live. Just keep to yourself and live your own life and let other people live their lives. And that's my thoughts on that. Next we have, Trump now says the U.S. left Iran's military alone as he considers deal, billions of your dollars well spent, from independent.co.uk, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the whole Iran military war and Trump's constant bombing of it, but ultimately, it doesn't really matter. People will just move on to the next thing. I think it's interesting. Trump on the campaign trail, he's saying we gotta put America first and stop having the U.S. be the world police. But, Trump, when he gets into office, he's suddenly all Israel first, and the U.S. needs to police the world. It just goes to show you, politicians oftentimes will say one thing on the campaign trail and then do the opposite thing in office. And it just goes to show you that, it's very much a phony job for phonies. And, with very few exceptions. But Thomas Massey was one, and he was principled, and that's why they kicked him out. Ultimately, the more principled a politician is, the less likely they are to be successful, and Trump is a good example of that. Next we have 2-minute video. Will MAGA through everything they had against Thomas Massey? They support Lindsey Graham. One has an A score, while the other has an S score on the Conservative Liberty Index, posted by Rebel Always. And yeah, personally, it just goes to show you that, Trump really has no values other than who's ever sucking his dick the hardest. To Thomas Massey is far more principled than Lindsey Graham. Well, I guess Lindsey Graham you could argue has principles too, even if I disagree with them. His principle are do whatever Israel wants and go get into war with every country that doesn't like Israel. And yeah, personally, it just would show you that, Thomas Massey is far more libertarian, but Trump doesn't like him because he doesn't suck his dick 24/7. Well, Lindsey Graham does, and that just goes to show you that, Trump has no principles other than who's sucking his dick the hardest. That's pretty much his whole ideology. He might try and present himself as, oh, I'm this great populist hero, but in reality, he has no principles other than whoever sucks his penis the hardest, as I said. Next, we have UK blocks visits by left-wing U.S. commentators Cenk Uygur and Hassan Piker from Yahoo.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But it's interesting how suddenly the left cares about the UK's anti-free speech position, because they were completely fine with the UK's anti-free speech positions when it came to arresting those who they considered homophobic or Islamophobic or whatever phobic or racist or sexist. The UK's been arresting people for social media posts that they've considered anti-progressive for a while, and Reddit didn't care. But suddenly, two members of the in-group are not allowed to visit for anti-free speech reasons, and it's the worst thing ever. The libertarian position is you gotta stand up against speech restrictions, regardless of whether they impact the in-group or the out-group. And I definitely do think, I don't personally care for Hassan Piker. Cenk Uyghur's a little bit better, but ultimately they should be allowed to visit whatever country they want to without fear of getting, being blocked for what they say on Israel. And yeah, you gotta stand up for free speech. It's interesting. A lot of conservatives say they're principled when it comes to the free speech, but then you criticize Israel, and suddenly they want you censored. It's like when it comes to the progressives, it's like they treat anti-Semitism like the woke treat racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, etc., etc. They just use it as an excuse to censor. And I personally don't think we should be censoring. And yeah, I think it's interesting also that the guy who posted this, he's had me censored from the subreddit for years at this point, and he doesn't see any irony at all about calling out about this censorship. But he's completely fine with censorship when he's the one doing it. And it just goes to show you, a lot of people aren't principled when it comes to censorship. They just want to censor any dissent at all, while demeaning the censorship that they dislike as the worst thing ever. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the federal government botched the bicentennial 2 from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if the state wants to, if the taxpayers want to pay for the state to throw celebrations for the bicentennial or whatever we want to roll now, I think it's the sesquicentennial, whatever you want to call it, America 250, I guess. They should be able to. But ultimately, I don't think taxpayers should pay if they don't want to. A lot of people are complaining that about Freedom 250 because that's Trump's personal one that he owns personally. But I think that's very much the libertarian position. It should be privately funded rather than publicly funded. I personally don't really care for Trump using the 250th anniversary to jerk himself off. But I do appreciate how he has his own privately funded 250th anniversary celebration rather than have the state's America 250, which you have to throw taxpayer dollars at for them to pretty much do nothing at all, just like you do with a lot of other taxpayer dollars. Next, we have the housing market is frozen, and it may stay that way until 2027 from BigMarketReport.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's cross was from the economic subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for. I think the libertarian position is, the housing market should be free and open, just like every other market. But ultimately, if the government wants to freeze any market for whatever reason whatsoever, ultimately they can do that. That's why I personally think the state's very inherently going to be anti-free market, because they're inherently going to control the market as much as possible, since they're in a position of authority to do so. And people are often, when they're in a position of authority, they can justify pretty much doing whatever they want, and you can't really hold them accountable. And they're also going to be self-serving as much as possible, since that's ultimately all people are self-serving, and the state is definitely a good example of that. Next, we have a proposal from Bernie Sanders to seize a direct ownership stake in AI companies, posted by Lemon Limelight, and they said, Bernie Sanders writes in the New York Times, AI is built in our collective intelligence, our books, songs, artwork, journalism, computer code, scientific research, videos, conversations, images, and ideas spanning generations. For the most part, tech oligarchs have fed this knowledge into the air. AI models without permission, without acknowledgement, without compensation. In other words, the creative work of millions of people, writers, artists, musicians, journalists, teachers, scientists, and ordinary citizens, has essentially been stolen by some some of the wealthiest people in the world. It's time for us to reclaim it. Since AI is built on the collective knowledge of humanity, the wealth it generates must benefit humanity. This is why I will soon be introducing the American AI Sovereign Wealth Fund Act. The legislation would help give the public a direct ownership stake in the largest AI companies in our country. How? It will create a sovereign wealth fund for a one-time 50% tax, not on the products of OpenAI, Anthropic, XAI, and other companies, but paid with something far more valuable than that, stock. And then the OP added, to put this in perspective, the three companies mentioned by name, OpenAI, Anthropic, and XAI, have a combined valuation of roughly $1.9 trillion, assuming all applicable companies approach to a total valuation over $2 trillion. Senators want to seize at least $1 trillion in private wealth. Is this a good idea? Is it justifiable? And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if it's a private company, it's their resources, they should be able to do whatever they want with them. I don't think the government should be taking $1 trillion in private wealth, but ultimately, if the government wants to justify taking that, that they have the ability to do so, since they are in the position of state authority. And yeah, I personally do like Bernie Sanders, but I disagree with him a lot on economics these days. Bernie Sanders is probably one of the better, more principled people in the U.S. Congress these days. I did used to support him before I really started disagreeing with him on economic issues primarily. But personally, I think the libertarian position is if it's a private company, it can do what it wants to, as long as it's not hurting anyone else. Sanders makes the argument, they've used stuff about permission and without acknowledgement without compensation, and yeah, personally, I don't think they should be doing that. But as long as it wasn't, owned by someone, they can do whatever they want. I think the libertarian position, you gotta be against intellectual property laws, since ownership is going to be very much a physical thing. If you put something out there and an AI company uses it for its AI model, maybe you should have been more protective of it rather than just put it out there for an AI company to use. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Trump's corrupt settlement with the IRS. It's 2 judicial roadblocks from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, I personally don't care for that. But, ultimately, it just goes to show you that, the government can justify doing whatever it wants to. Maybe the courts will say otherwise, but a lot of people are going to defer to what the president says, and Trump's the president, so ultimately, it comes down to who has the authority to do what. If people want to justify following what the courts say, they should be able to, but they want to justify following what the president says, they should be able to. I personally don't care for whatever the government says, regardless of what faces on it, whether it be the Congress, the presidency, or the courts. They're all just private, they're all just individuals, and just because they're in a position of state authority doesn't give them the authority to tell other people what to do if they don't feel like it, as long as they're not hurting anyone else. Next, we have data centers behaving like acoustic weapons, posted by EasyCZ75, and that's a YouTube video from Ben Jordan. And yeah, personally, I do think data centers can be kind of noisy, but that's ultimately, if someone wants to build a data center on their own property, that's their decision to do so. Build whatever you want on your own property. I personally wouldn't care for it if a data center was noisy by my house and kept me up 24/7. But ultimately, it just goes to show you that, ultimately it comes down to whatever the property owner wants. And sometimes you might not like what the property owner wants, but it's their property. And if you don't like it, you're always free to move someplace else. And yeah, I think it's interesting. A lot of progressives are saying, oh, data centers are too noisy. But, I remember they had an article, I think, from The Atlantic a while ago, and it was, why do rich people love quiet? Sound, gentrification, and silence. And because, they love loud noises when it's woke city noises, but when it's the data center, suddenly loud noises are the worst thing ever. It just goes to show you, people aren't principled. They only have the teams, when the in-group's making loud noises, like in a city, I guess maybe like a city band or something, Reddit's completely fine with them, and they'll say stuff like that Atlantic article says, why do rich people love quiet? But suddenly, when the out-group starts making loud noises, it's the worst thing ever, like you see with them in data centers. Next, we have Trump's cotton bailout is never signed as tariffs aren't working from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately, if the government wants to bail out anything, ultimately they can justify bailing out whoever they want to. I personally think that goes against the free market, but, ultimately, a lot of what the state does goes against the free market, and there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Indiana police misplaced more than $30,000 seized in massage parlor prostitution raids from Reason.com, posted by Jolly Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but that's ultimately the government. They can misplace however many dollars it feels like it, and oftentimes, there's no reason why you can hold them accountable since they control the courts and legal system as well. Next, we have Now Let's Stop the Trump IRS Exemptions from posted by Frankie6067, and they said the Justice Department said it will abide by a federal judge's temporary order blocking creation of Trump's $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund, and they linked to a USA Today article about that. And yeah, personally, I don't think the U.S. should be spending $1.8 billion on this fund, but ultimately, if they want to start doing it, they're in a position of state authority to do so. And, the judges might say otherwise, but ultimately it comes down to who has the ability to do what. Trump's gotten away with so much over the past decade, he can probably get away with this as well, and that's ultimately how it all works a lot of the time. People do what they can get away with, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next we have Judge says MPS can't revoke DC protest permit over 8647 flag from thehill.com, posted by Jolly Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think there should be any protest permits in the first place. If you want to protest, you should be able to. You shouldn't have to ask daddy government permission to do that. If you want to do just by doing something, you shouldn't ask that. You shouldn't have to ask the government permission. Just do it. If you feel like doing it, do whatever you feel like. You shouldn't have to ask the government permission for it. Next we have, anyone noticed almost every libertarian or anarchist online group on social media eventually comes full of Republicans, MAGA, and everyone, even ones who are obsessed with race, or posted by Historical Donut 6758, and they said, when you make a post condemning state-sanctioned segregation racism, like mentioning that the U.S. government primarily created the black-white wealth gap, promoting open borders, condemning the war on drugs, condemning NIMBY law, condemning the George Floyd murder, condemning Trump's race-based refugee policy, etc., almost invariable on the comments on the post in such groups, you bet quote-unquote libertarians condemning the post you are outright called a leftist or Marxist. Even though I got more into libertarians than Ron Paul 2008, the trend in these groups is the result of the Ron Paul effect, who was more libertarian than the majority of Republicans but still wasn't fully libertarian. The result of the Ron Paul effect is that he not only attracted people who would eventually become anarchists, he attracted people who were initially receptive to libertarian ideals, but went on to become MAGA. The latter group of people make up the majority of the people who are drawn to libertarianism by Ron Paul, and that's why you see quote-unquote libertarian groups online like the ones I described. And yeah, personally, I definitely do think libertarian in the U.S. is a pretty right-coded word, just like liberal is a pretty left-coded word. But, ultimately, I do think, that the libertarian position is if you want to be left-coded or right-coded, you should be able to do so. If you want to call people out for being too left-coded or right-coded, you should be able to do so. But, Reddit's one to talk, because this subreddit is a huge leftist circle jerk, and it claims to be both libertarian and uncensored. It's very much like the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It's neither libertarian nor uncensored, despite claiming to be both. And that's very much how a lot of stuff works these days. People will claim to be one thing and then do the opposite. It's very much how, you can't take people at their words a lot of the time, It's like whenever you criticize Antifa, oh, you don't like Antifa, you must be a fascist, since Antifa means anti-fascist, and it just goes to show you that you can't hide behind words. Just because they say one thing doesn't mean they're always gonna abide by that label. It just goes to it's like how North Korea is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, even though it's not democratic or a republic, or how the National German Socialist Workers' Party. People, they'll always say, oh, the Nazis weren't socialists, it doesn't matter what's in the name, but they're the same people who say, oh, you can't criticize Antifa because that makes you a fascist, because Antifa means anti-fascist, You just can't let words dictate how people do. You have to judge them by their actions, not their words. Next we have the Republican Party's moral collapse under Trump is complete opinion from Cincinnati.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's crossword from the Thomas Massey subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Trump, but, ultimately, I would say both parties don't really have too much moral high ground to stand on. Trump, of course, is, Trump. He's very much politically incorrect and always baiting people as much as possible with he's pretty much edgy George W. Bush, But the left, meanwhile, they're pretty much biggest issue at this point is they want drag queens jerking off in front of kids, so they don't really have too much of a moral high ground stand on either. It's very much like that one passage from the Gospel of John in the Bible. Let he who's without sin cast the first stone. Everyone sins in their own way, but ultimately people's morality. They're gonna always make excuses when it's the in group, but when it's the out group, suddenly they'll throw the book at them as much as hard as possible. And then there was another post I wanted to do. I did the Libertarian Party USA subreddit as well. I said, one of the worst things about the government is how by the book it tends to be. I said, if you've been following my Reddit account for long enough, you know they have to rely on my area's government-run paratransport to get home from one of my jobs. They had an incident in which I managed to make it up to the bus before it left, but the driver told me that they already canceled dispatch, canceled the ride, even though I wasn't really late for it, and therefore they couldn't drive me home. It's got me thinking about how one of the biggest problems with the government is how aggressively by the book it tends to be. The driver could have driven me home if she felt like it, but since the bureaucratic procedure said otherwise, she decided not to. It's a huge problem. Government workers oftentimes care more about following procedures to the letter than actually using your discretion to make their own decisions, and this is just one example of that. And then one user replied, this one-eyed C4T guy replied, that's silly. They aren't being by the book. They aren't following the Constitution strictly. If anything, they aren't by the book enough. I replied, in regards to a lot of electoral politicians, that's true, but I'm talking about more about government workers here. It just goes to show you that it doesn't really matter what's written down on any piece of paper in regards to the law. What matters is that people are willing to justify it in any given moment. It's like how murder has been illegal for pretty much the entire history of written law, yet it still happens. Ultimately, it just goes to show you that words are just laws on a piece of paper. What matters is what are people going to actually enforce? And that's my thoughts there. So I think we're going to see if there's anything new. Looks like there's nothing new, so we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.